them. And, you know, no matter how awful West Virginia can be politically or socially or economically, wow, it's just pretty here. And that's great, unless you're hungry. And if you're hungry, the woods can be sort of a mixed blessing, that there's things in there that can be eaten, but not a lot, right? And so if you're hungry, you think about utility. You think about, so what are these woods useful for? And so when the first white settlers came, they saw the forest both as a resource and an impediment, that the natives have been living here for countless generations and living in the forest as home. But for the white settlers, it was mostly resource and impediment. Scott, can you throw up the forest picture for us? Big ones, right? So I mean, not all the trees were this size, but that gives you a sense of the forest, right? And like, if you're trying to cut that down, it's an impediment, right? If you're trying to turn something that size into a house, it's going to take you a while. There's a lot of work. The forest as a resource or simply just something that was in the way, what they tended to do is they tended to cut it down. And the first settlers, they just cut down like what they needed, small pieces here and there, enough, you know, to clear for whatever it is they needed. But after a while, they got a bit more serious about cutting down. And with the invention of the bandsaw and things like that, things picked up. Scott, can you give us a clear-cut picture?
Oh.
Yeah, so that's what, I mean, that's actually a picture from Pennsylvania, but that's what happened to West Virginia, is they just cut it all down. And someone did the calculation and calculated that if you took all of the lumber that they cut down from West Virginia, you could build a boardwalk 10 feet wide and 2 inches thick all the way to the moon. And a little bit tricky to build, right? But a lot of wood, right? So Scott, the logs picture. Serious amounts of forests. Now, what happens when you cut down a forest like that is that you leave a lot of stuff behind, all the little tiny branches, and all the tops of the trees and the stuff that doesn't quite fit into that exact size and that exact shape. And so what happened next was fires. And the fires swept through West Virginia, and they not only burned the stuff that was left over, but they burned all of the new growth and all of the little stuff that was already growing, and all the little stuff that was already there, and they burned the soil itself, right? So that many parts of the soil became, right, and instead of like all of this cut down stuff contributing to the richness of the soil was destroyed. Someone has said that West Virginia might be almost heaven, but it was grown from the ashes of Eden. Scott, the Dolly Sods picture. Yeah, so that's what happens when you cut it down and then it burns down afterwards. And, right, Dolly Sods has never recovered, right? We're 100 years later. So that's what happens, right? And it's a little reminder that stuff matters. How we treat the forest matters. It has long-term effects, and it still has effects today. So our commitment to God's vision for the earth is shown in the way we treat the earth. And it's all part of the same package, right? This is all connected in really important ways. And for the church, this package starts in Genesis. Now, the part we read in Genesis was about something called a covenant. This is God's reciprocal commitment to Abraham and then the generations that followed. And so Abraham was supposed to commit himself to God and to his family, and also that his family would be committed to God. And then the last verse of all of this said that all of this commitment between God and Abraham included a very specific piece of land. This land. I am giving you this land in perpetuity. And those verses continue to echo today in the state of Israel, but they also continue to echo in our country, right? That this was the idea of the first settlers in this country, and the first white settlers. The white settlers came in here and said, this is our land. This is not their land. God gave us this land, so we're going to kick them out and, chop it all down, because this is, right? So this, right, these ideas, right, back in this really old book matter. Now, if we looked at this a lot more closely and we had a lot of time, we would notice that it isn't that simple. Because God doesn't just come to Abraham once and say, okay, here's the deal. Rather, God comes to Abraham over a series of years, and the deal keeps changing. The very first time God comes to Abraham, God says, I'm going to be your God. I'm going to do great things for you. That's it. Well, who wouldn't take, right? Who would take that deal? Someone comes to you and says, I'm going to do wonderful things for you. You go, sure, you can do that. So Abraham says, sure, I can do that. Then the next time that God comes to Abraham, God says, okay, yeah, I'm going to do wonderful things for you. To seal this, you got to sacrifice some animals. Abraham's got lots of animals. Having, sacrificing a few, no big deal one way or another. And besides that, at the end of the ritual, you've got all these animals, which you're quite free to eat, have a big party, right? So it's a celebration, right? Then this time that we read, when God came to Abraham, something new gets added, right? Or some significant new things get added, right? And the first thing that gets added is land, right? Well, first Abraham gets a new name, but like Abraham, not a big deal, right? But then land gets included. And while this is a big thing, right? It's not just like, well, I'm going to be with you and, you get to wander around the world and I'll be with you, but you get some land. You get like this whole chunk of land is going to be yours forever. But if we keep reading, we would also have another addition, and that is circumcision. Now, Abram's an older man, and this is like cuts pretty close to home, if I can say it that way. Right? I'm sure Abraham looked at God and said, like, how about an earring? Right? I could wear an earring, and that'd be like simpler, right? And or like my finger, we'll cut a little skin off my finger. How about that? Right? Because it's like circumcision. Wow, that's a different sort of commitment. The next time that God comes to Abraham, God says to Abraham, oh, by the way, you need to sacrifice your son to me. You need to go and kill your son for me. Well, this takes the commitment to a totally new level, right? But Abram's pretty invested by this time, right? He's been at this a long time. And so he almost goes through with this until God, right, rescues him and rescues his son. And then later, when it's Isaac's turn to get the covenant passes on to Isaac. Isaac gets the same deal, right? You get all of this stuff. I'm going to be your God. It's all going to be great. Oh, by the way, you got to obey the whole law too, right? So God just keeps sort of ratcheting things up. It's important to understand that this isn't about religion, right? This is about your whole life. And the goal of this covenant, the goal of this commitment to God isn't about religion. And it isn't about being more religious or even being more spiritual. The goal is to commit your whole life and your family to something greater than yourself, something greater than your family, something greater than your tribe. In a lot of ways, it's like an increasing commitment you might have to forests, to get back to our forest metaphor, right? I first encountered West Virginia forests by driving past them on the highway, right? 70 miles an hour going, oh, wow, beautiful forests. But then at some point, right? Besides just zooming past the forest, I stopped and I looked and I went, wow, they look different standing here than they do at 70 miles an hour. I'm just gonna, so you get to some of the overlooks, or even just stop beside the road and look at the forest. And then you increase your commitment to the forest by going for a hike. That's a very different sort of commitment because you got to be ready for a hike. And you've got to be paying attention, because if you're not paying attention, suddenly all you see is trees and you don't know where your car is anymore. And you're officially lost. And you can get pretty seriously lost in West Virginia. And you can get pretty seriously hungry while you're lost in West Virginia. So a hike is a significantly larger commitment. But after a while, you raise the bar a bit and you say, I'm not just going to walk through the forest. I'm going to try to figure out what it is I'm walking through, right? So we got different trees here and we got little plants on the ground, or maybe there aren't any plants on the ground. And then why aren't there plants on the ground? And where are all the small bushes? And doesn't look like this forest I've seen. And so you start to study it. And then after you've studied it, maybe you go, maybe I should advocate for better forestry practices, or maybe I should advocate, or maybe I should come out there and cut down some of these invasive species, right? So you get involved. You get involved in the forest, and right, because you have this desire for something better, something more. And then maybe one day you just crank it all up and you say, okay, I'm just going to go live in the forest off the grid, and build myself a log cabin, go survive out there in the forest. In this increasing commitment. So the Bible contains this ongoing call to deeper commitment. And right, Jesus just sort of puts it all out there in the passage we read. Jesus says, oh, by the way, I'm going to die. Everyone's going to die, but I'm going to get tortured to death, says Jesus. And maybe you too. Wow. I realize I haven't done much this morning to make commitment look very appealing. Right? This has been really bad salesmanship. But Jesus did that too, right? The Bible's very clear here that, right, if you're just in this for all of the blessings, you're on the wrong train here. You're walking down the wrong path into the wrong forest. This is not a forest that's all about the blessings. Right? This is a forest that's also, there are blessings. Don't get me wrong, right? But this is also a reality that's about work. When the first settlers walked into the forest, or when anybody walks into the forest of West Virginia, there's a certain commitment here and there's a significant risk. Before I get any further, I want to also say that I don't think about commitment as a big problem that we need to solve here. I'm not very worried, because the people, you guys, you folks are committed. Most of you are here every Sunday. And you're not just committed to show up here Sunday morning, but you're committed to your families, you're committed to your community, you're committed to the world, you're committed to each other. And so I'm not here to tell you you should really get more committed. In fact, some of you, right, I don't know, right? But this sort of commitment is different than what we talked about last week. Because last week we talked about water, and our commitment to water in a lot of ways is pretty automatic, right? If you're in a lake and you find yourself deep, deep, deep inside the lake, you don't have to think about whether or not you want to kick to the surface, right? Your body's going to start screaming for oxygen after, and you're going to kick to the surface, for all of your worth automatically. Or you don't wake up in the morning and go, today, I'm going to get thirsty sometime. I've decided I'm going to get thirsty. You don't have to decide that. You're going to get thirsty. But the woods are different. The woods are a decision, right? You can stay in your house and right, never go out into the woods, even in West Virginia. So where does the desire for deeper commitment come? I think ideally it comes, first of all, from compassion. Compassion we have for others, for our community, for our world. We are with compassion. We are born feeling the pain of other people. This is something that's rooted inside of us, but it's something that can be unlearned. And because it can be unlearned, we have to deliberately not unlearn it. We have to deliberately nurture the compassion that's in us and find healthy ways of showing it, of living out that compassion. Sometimes deeper commitment also comes from frustration. Because when we see what could be, when we imagine how much better life could be in West Virginia, right, in the United States, in the world, and then we see all of the stupid things that people do every day to make it worse. Right? I don't know if you've been following what's been going on in Charleston these days with all of the interesting ways that our government is finding to make things worse for West Virginians. And it's so frustrating, right? And hopefully, right, we can find it in ourselves to take that frustration and turn it into commitment to trying to make things better. But it doesn't have to come from something like that. It can also come from encouragement, right? This is where we do this together. And when we see somebody doing something that makes the world a better place, we can say, hey, thanks. Right? Glad, I see you doing that. I'm glad you're doing it. We can do this together. Right? There are so many ways to encourage one another in this commitment we have to the world. It also comes from belonging. Right? Here we are, Morgantown Church of the Brethren. You belong here. Right? We want you to think about this as your home, right? Whether the family metaphor works for you or not, right? Or however you think about this group, we want you to think about this as your group, that you are part of this larger us. And from that, right, we continue to commit ourselves more deeply to one another and to the world around us. Right? So in all of this, we need to continue to move beyond selfishness. We need to continue to move beyond complacency, always trying to move into more, right? Or less, right? Sometimes we need to move into less. Sometimes we're just too much, right? You can become overcommitted. You can become, right, to switch the metaphor a little bit, to a place where you should be committed because you're acting a little bit crazy. Don't do that. Right? You need to also take time to breathe. You need to take time to appreciate what is. You need to take time to go for a walk in the woods. But our commitment to one another and to the world is also about sustaining this desire because of the frustration, because of the roadblocks in our way. How do we continue in this? So that's our sermon for this morning.